The next series of films highlights the development and testing of the Me-163B. The B model was the ultimate version of the Me-163 line. This was the actual combat version of the aircraft. The vast majority of Me-163B flights were for development purposes, however, although the aircraft did finally see limited combat experience beginning in the middle of 1944. You'll note that there are significant shape differences between the Me-163B and the earlier A model and the DFS-194. The landing gear is substantially more robust on the B model than it was on the earlier A model. Here we can see a couple of ground crew members wrestling the jettisonable takeoff gear into place. We can also see the extensible landing gear as well. The Me-163B was a much larger aircraft than the earlier A model, where a pilot could easily just flop over the side of the canopy sill on the A model. A ladder was required for access to the cockpit on the B model. As the canopy closes, we can see an air vent at the leading edge of the canopy. You'll note also that the canopy is hinged to the side on the B model, whereas on the A model it was hinged to the rear. Here we see the servicing cart for the turbine being rolled away from the aircraft. There was a turbine inside the Me-163B which drove the fuel pumps for the T-Stuff and C-Stuff propellants that powered the Walter rocket motor. We can catch glimpses of the extensible tail wheel at the aft end of the Me-163B in some of these shots. This has changed from a tail skid on the A model. On the early B models, this tail wheel was unfaired. In some of the later B models that we will see later in this film, a fairing is constructed around that tail wheel to improve aerodynamic efficiency. As with the earlier members of the Me-163 family, including the DFS-194, climb performance for the B model was simply outstanding. Again, the aircraft was capable of climbing from a standing start to roughly 40,000 feet in 3 to 3.5 minutes. While the aircraft's performance was remarkable, this performance has to be balanced against the fact that it took a long time to prepare an Me-163B for flight. Unlike conventional combat aircraft used by the Luftwaffe, such as the Focke-Wulf 190 or the Me-109, you couldn't simply scramble an Me-163 to meet an oncoming threat. After the aircraft came to a stop, clearing it from the airfield was a major challenge, and a device was created to do that, the German name of which I won't even begin to try to pronounce. This device had airbags that were inflated under the wings of the aircraft, lifting it off the ground and enabling it to be removed from the field. It was later replaced by a device that used rigid arms instead of inflatable airbags. In these head-on shots of an Me-163B, there's a couple notable things here. First is the propeller at the very nose of the aircraft. This was used to drive a small electrical generator which would be used to power instrumentation and radios on board the aircraft. Also visible in those shots, just above the well for the landing skid, was a small hole where a tow line could be attached. Most Me-163 flights of all members of the series were done in an unpowered mode, glide flights, generally using an Me-110 as a tow aircraft. Landing skid failures were fairly frequent with the Komet. The landing skid was hydraulically extended, and frequently that hydraulic system would fail. The next series of shots are going to give us some wonderful views of some of the interesting details on the Me-163B. Here, very noticeable is a flap, an undersurface wing flap that is partially extended. Note that those flaps fit onto the surface of the wing and are not recessed into the wing. Also notable here is the extended tail wheel. Note that this is a later Me-163B and that it has the fairing on the tail wheel. In just a moment, we're going to get some very good shots of the aft end of the aircraft. You can see here that smoke is still pouring from the nozzle of the Walter rocket engine. We mentioned earlier that the takeoff roll was especially difficult for Me-163 pilots. In addition to just the sheer length of the roll, directional stability was a problem during the early portion of the roll before the rudder became effective. A device called the Strahl rudder was tested on both the A and B models that would fit into the exhaust of the Walter rocket engine to give the pilot a bit of additional directional control during the early takeoff roll. Here we see the airbag version of the aircraft transporter in use. The next sequence of shots is especially fascinating because it gives us some glimpses of some of the more significant figures in the history of the Me-163. The woman in this photo is Hannah Reich. She was a prominent test pilot in Nazi Germany, a personal friend of Adolf Hitler, and she had campaigned heavily to be given the opportunity to fly the Me-163. The tall gentleman with sunglasses and a protective overcoat on is Heinrich Dittmar, who was one of the early test pilots very closely associated with the Me-163 program. We'll come back to the story of Hannah Reich in just a moment. Here we see some footage showing testing of a motor on an Me-163. A couple things are notable here. First, there's a protective cover that's been placed on the aft edge of the rudder. You can also see in several of these shots mock diamonds in the exhaust plume. That's indicative of the supersonic flow coming out of the engine. Here we have an Me-163B taking off from a paved runway. This would have been a much preferable experience for the pilots to a takeoff on an unimproved airfield. Another change that took place with the landing gear late in the program involved the landing gear. The early landing gear used on both the A and B models was rigid with no suspension. Not only were the takeoffs hard on the pilots, but they were hard on the aircraft as well. So eventually, shock absorbers were built into that takeoff gear to protect both the pilots and the aircraft itself. Here we have an Me-163B on tow behind an Me-110 tow aircraft. Most Me-163 testing and training occurred not under rocket power, but on towed flights. Let's move back to the story of Hannah Reich and the Me-163. Again, she had campaigned fairly aggressively to be given the opportunity to fly this aircraft, and she ended up flying the Komet a total of 5 times. On her final flight in a Komet, the takeoff gear failed to release just after takeoff, and she was forced to return to the field for a very hard landing. Her injuries were such that she was kept out of the cockpit for the next 5 months and never did fly the Komet again. The next series of films shows another individual who's very closely associated with the Komet program, Rudi Opitz. He, like Reich and Dittmar, was a very experienced glider pilot, and as such was especially valuable to the Me-163 program. Here we see him getting into an Me-163B. You'll note the machine gun protruding from the leading edge of the wing there. Also visible in many of these shots is the very thick piece of armored glass immediately in front of the pilot. Again, this was a combat aircraft at this point, and that piece of glass, along with an armored nose cone, was designed to protect the pilots as they flew straight at approaching Allied forces. In all likelihood, this is yet another test flight for the Komet. You'll note the very large data acquisition camera that Opitz has bolted to his head there in many of these shots. That's a spring-driven camera that the pilot can use to take photographs of the instrument panel during critical portions of the flight. It's certainly a far cry from the digital data acquisition equipment used on test aircraft today, and even a far cry from the crude analog systems used in the late 40s through the 50s and 60s.